when you try to create a single coherent method that some alleged medieval artist cooked up in his lab and then was lost to history, you just can't do it. It's not going to reproduce all of the image features as observed on the shroud.
Hey, Guy Powell here with the backstory on the Shroud of Turin. Today, we're going to do something very, very different. It's not going to necessarily be a direct interview. I've got Dale Glover on here. He's been on a couple of times, and he is definitely a Shroud authenticist and Christian apologist. It's always fun to talk to him, and I think we've got going to have some really interesting stuff. And what we're going to be talking about stems out of a conversation that Dale had with a gentleman named James Fodor. And James is a cognitive neuroscientist, PhD. And if you want to find out more about him, he's at the scienceofeverything.net as well as jamesfodor.com. And he is not a shroud authenticist. I don't know if I would call him a medievalist, but probably, but he's definitely a non-shroud authenticist, I guess would be the right term. And so, in any case, we're going to have, and I'll have Dale introduce himself here in a little bit in more detail because he can certainly do a better job than I can. And then Tavo moderated the discussion. Tavo's son, Aubrey. He moderated the discussion between Dale and James. And now he is also with Real Seekers, but he's an agnostic. He's kind of on the fence, and nothing wrong with that. I mean, those are the people that, of course, we as Christians want to reach out to and understand, what their challenges are. And of course, just like Dale and me is evangelism, and we want to bring certainly more Christians into the fold. So, with that, this video that we're talking about aired about 4 weeks ago on July 10th. And I'll put in the show notes the actual link to the video so that, like I said, you can take a look at it and then see what the discussion was. And then what we're going to do is we're going to go through about 10 different questions today that came up that I think really indicate where James got things not quite right. And I'm putting that mildly, but I don't want to say he got him 100% wrong, but he got him 100% wrong. So, in any case, Dale, tell us a little bit about you, and then we'll start kicking things off.
2,000 years ago, something happened that changed the world. A burial cloth witnessed the most significant moment in human history: the resurrection of Jesus Christ. It survived fires, wars, plagues, and floods, traveling across empires and centuries, to become either the most sacred relic ever known or history's greatest fake. What do you believe? The Only Witness. A compelling history of the Shroud of Turin by Guy R. Powell. The Only Witness is available now on Amazon. Get your copy today.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, thank you so much for that intro, guy. Yeah, so as you said, I've kind of been on your show at least three times, and you've been on my show a number of times, seven or eight or something like that. So I'm no stranger to doing shows with you and that sort of thing. I've always appreciated the quality of your show with the interviews and the quality of guests that you bring on and that sort of thing. So just a little bit about me for anyone who may not know. So I'm the host of a podcast called Real Seekers, and I've been in the game since about 2018, doing podcasts on topics related to the philosophy of religion. So things like the existence of God, or historical evidence for the resurrection, and that sort of thing, and also Christian apologetics as well. So I have a area of specialization in the Shroud of Turin, and I call that my Shroud Wars podcast, where I try my best. I think it's really important to have a variety of formats. So the interview format is great. It's necessary. The lecture format is great. We need that. But we also need debates. We need skeptics, agnostics, and pro shroud people to talk to each other, and kind of iron sharpens iron there. So I've been lucky enough to host a few debates and to be a part of some debates on that front.
Yeah, absolutely. And that Shroud Wars, I think you're so right. When you are when you have two individuals, one with one opinion and set of facts, and one with another one and a set of facts. And I think, and the set of facts is kind of loosely stated because we all interpret facts differently. But I think you're right. It really is true that iron does sharpen iron, and having that argumentation. Discussion, not an argument, but a discussion where you get both sides of the equation, I think really helps out a lot. So, but we're going to dig right in. We're going to jump right in here. And one of the questions that came up early on in the discussion was that, and James says, well, there's no historical mention of the shroud prior to the 14th century. Now, in the 14th century is really when the provenance started, and he may have confused the term provenance versus mentions, historical mentions, because provenance means that you have a really good documented ownership of something, in this case, the shroud, a documented ownership that goes back then from today all the way back to about the middle of the 14th century. So Dale, tell us what your thoughts are on there, and let's go from there.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, I think this is a false assertion on James's part. It's not true that the shroud's history just goes back to the 1350s. Obviously, speaking from the pro-shroud side, there are a number of different evidences, both textual and otherwise, that I call sort of historical anchor points that establish that. But the first thing I just wanted to point out is I think that James was just kind of taking advantage of the fact that both the pro-shroud side and the shroud skeptic side agree that the shroud is what's being mentioned in the Darcy memorandum in, speaking of it around the 1350s. So that's the earliest uncontroversial mention of the shroud, but it's not the first or the earliest. So as I said, we have basically historical anchor points. We have things like the link to the Sudarium of Oviedo, which pushed the shroud back. It's been forensically linked through the blood flows and that sort of thing. You've had Caesar Barta on your show explaining that evidence. So that pushes it all the way back to the 6th century at the latest, or earlier. There's also been very interesting evidence by Giulio Fonte and Dr. Liberato De Caro on the X-ray dating and other scientific, physical-based dating tests, which actually place the shroud all the way back into the 1st century. Beyond that, we do have various texts which can attest to the shroud at various points in its pre-medieval history. And I take Jack Marquardt's image of God incarnate hypothesis. So just an example of a text. I think this is the one Jack says is the most important text, but it's a chronicle of Pseudo-Zechariah, where it's mentioning this cloth with images, miraculous images, not made with human hands. And it's the first instance in all of human history to an image that has this property, archeo poeta, not made with human hands, kind of thing. So that's an instrumental cloth where we say, yeah, that's speaking of the same object we today call the Shroud of Turin. And obviously that can be debated, but I think James in the debate was just kind of asserting, well, no, all those are just other shrouds. We can forget all those. The only ones that matter are in the medieval period. And in fairness, for the purposes of the debate, I sort of granted that by saying, let's pretend it is medieval. Who cares? I can still prove it's a miracle.
Yeah, and that was a great argument as well. And but I think though, we miss the point on the evidence, and certainly some evidence prior to the 14th century is more indirect, and some of it is more very factual and very historical and accepted. So we have, as you know, we have the Robert de Clary texts that he wrote about the Fourth Crusade, and he believes he actually saw the Shroud of Turin unfolded on certain days when he was in Constantinople. There are other folks that mention the shroud or a shroud-like image, Nicholas Meserites and others in the 12th century, and there's actually surprisingly many And then, of course, as you mentioned, there's also some other things that are kind of indirect as it relates to the depiction of the image. So we have the image on the shroud, but we have it depicted by man, so to speak, in coins going all the way back to the 640s. We've got other paintings and mosaics and marble inlays that go all the way back. I think potentially all the way back to 395 AD with one of them. And so there is quite a bit of what I argue with historians about is you have textual written evidence, but you also have artistic evidence that shows that, hey, there is this image that was there and these works of art were copied on there.
And you know what? Just to interject quickly, what's interesting is that the skeptics in the debate, it was James Fodor and the skeptics who made that art history link. Now they made a fallacious argument about how it's connected to basically the shroud is a copy of this medieval Gothic style, and what's their evidence linking it? Well, he has long arms, and they depict him with long fingers, and that was enough for the skeptic to go, well, yeah, the shroud is connected to these pieces of art. Well, if you look at the pro shroud side to these artworks going back to 395 AD, the pro shroud argumentation linking the shroud as the impetus for these paintings is much more sophisticated and stronger than the skeptics' connection of long arms. We have statistical arguments, we have polarized image overlay techniques being used, and things like the Vignette markings, plus, my gosh, your own study that has gone into a lot of rigor on that front. So it's just funny that the skeptics are prepared to accept that argument when it suits them on very flimsy associations or evidential links, but they dismiss everything on the pro shroud, linking it to artwork centuries earlier.
Yeah, that is so. You're so right there. And one thing I think too is the pro shroud authenticists have done the homework, and they now I will admit myself, I am not an expert in all the scientific stuff and the blood, and I am an amateur historian. I'm definitely not a trained historian, but I have done research, and I was on Dale's show in a series of three things going through a lot of the artistic evidence that's out there, and it's almost overwhelming as to what's available.
Yeah, yeah, I
So
totally agree.
yeah. All right. Well, let's go to the next one, which I think is also kind of an interesting one, and I think has some challenges for a non-authenticist to kind of refute, and that is the concept of what seems to be the 3D image encoding, that 3D information that's actually built into the image and was first discovered in, I think it was 1976, before the STERP study in 1978, when John Jackson and Eric Jumper and then Pete Schumacher used what's called the VP8 image analyzer and actually saw and proved that there is some kind of a 3D imagery encoded into the face and the body that's on the shroud. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so obviously you're correct. Yeah, first it was suspected decades earlier. I think Paul Vignon mentioned that he had suspicions that there was three-dimensional info encoded in it, but it wasn't until 1976 that we actually had empirical confirmation from the VP8 image analyzer with John Jackson and that's where they actually proved scientifically that there is actual depth information or topographical information corresponding to a body distance related to the cloth kind of thing encoded into the images of the Shroud of Turin itself. And that's totally unlike any other paintings or photos. I was sort of very surprised in the debate with James, because James kind of said, well, look, there's depth information in it. I had my photograph of myself in Jerusalem. He's like, well, I can discern depth information. You're in front of the weeping wall, or the western wall there, and but what he doesn't understand is that's an illusion. That's basically a perception in our brain based on shadows and trickery of light versus shadows and stuff like that, where our brain pieces together a false image that makes sense to us, right? But there's no actual topographical information encoded in these photographs. If you were to plug that into a VPA, you get a scrambled up mess because there is no real depth info encoded there. So that's the main difference with the Shroud. There's real depth info encoded there.
Well, and it's also interesting, exactly, and you can see 3D depth image in the face and the body, of course, being present, and then you can also see it not being present in typical photographs, like you're talking about for the Wailing Wall there in Jerusalem. The other thing that's interesting is that on the shroud, there's also burn marks from the Chambéry fire, and those don't have the 3D imagery encoded into it. So here you have something that the eye recognizes as a burn mark, and it does not show up the same way as the 3D imagery encoding that you see on the face and the body when you put it through the VP8 image analyzer. And I think that right there is it's kind of proof that the image is made differently that we see when we look at it, the face and the body, versus when we see something else that also has color to it and what have you, which are the burn marks on the same piece of cloth.
Yeah, absolutely. I think those scorch marks provide sort of a falsification for this common skeptical claim that, oh well, anybody could encode 3D images with some kind of scorch or something like that. Because basically the topographical info is based on the lights and darks of the images and that sort of thing. Whereas the darker the image is, that means it was closest to the cloth, like the tip of the nose kind of thing, and the lighter it is, the further away it was. But yeah, like the scorches, as you say, are really proof positive that can't happen accidentally. This must have been produced by an actual three-dimensional body image, because the information encoded in this depth info corresponds precisely with an actual body and its distance to the cloth at the time of encodation. So yeah, like it's not just there some random accident that some medieval artist happened to get, as Walter Macron or Hugh Ferry might like to argue.
Right, right. I'm going to skip over one, and I'm going to go to the because we're talking about the image, and now he I think, prefers the concept that the image was made through a bas-relief. Now, as opposed to an unknown way that the scientists kind of agree with, that it's still unknown and uncertain as to how the image on the shroud was made. So, talk a little bit about what a bas-relief image is, and how that gets generated, and then why the shroud is not a bas-relief.
Yeah, so basically, there's a well-known effect called the wraparound distortion effect that this has been known about since the 1930s, and skeptics love to hone in on this, and they'll say there are certain lateral distortions that will obtain if you have a three-dimensional body, and or a sculpture, and you wrap the cloth around, and somehow the images are encoded. Well, when you flatten that cloth out, the image is going to be stretched out. It's going to have these lateral distortions. So skeptics will say, well, see, this proves that they must have used a bas-relief. It couldn't have been something that's 360 degrees. It's a bas-relief is basically sort of like a semi-sculpture where like part of it is sculpted, but the sides are just flat kind of thing. So think on the Parthenon in Athens, Greece. The Greeks would have these bas-reliefs on top. They're not full three-dimensional sculptures, but they have some three-dimensionality to them. And essentially, certain skeptics, Hugh Ferry, Luigi Garlascelli, Joe Nickel, they posit, well, if we use a bas-relief, that will get us images that are much more vertically aligned, like we see with the Shroud of Turin. And subsequent experiments by a skeptic, Cicero Morris, apparently confirm this. They say, well, look at the images produced by a 360-degree person. There's these huge distortions, but ones with bas-reliefs, they're much more shroud-like. They're closer to the shroud. Now, the problem I raised with that is I cited Cicero to James, and James was using Cicero as his source. And I said, but even Cicero admits there's, even with a bas relief, there's still going to be lateral distortions. Yes, they're subtler than if you used a body or a sculpture, but there's still distortions present, which make it inconsistent with the images we see on the shroud. So I think this is a falsification. We know it wasn't a bas relief that was used because bas reliefs can't reproduce the images that we see with the Shroud of Turin. There's still going to be lateral distortions. And it's just funny that the skeptics, so, well, it's close enough. Gee, why do you have to be so hyper, rigorous in reproducing this? Well, I didn't know science was so lax on the skeptic side, but yeah,
Yeah.
that's
Well,
my
they're
take.
only lax on their own arguments, but on yours, then they're not so lax.
Oh
That's right.
yeah,
Now, one of the other things on the bas relief is that it really only gives you one side, and it doesn't give you the bottom side, whereas the shroud, which is believed to have been wrapped on the bottom of the body and then it wrapped around the top of the body. And so then the image is believed to have been generated all at once, where the image somehow was it generated on the top of the body and then on the bottom of the body. But a bas relief is very different. You can't get both sides kind of at the same time. And talk about that a little bit.
exactly. Yeah, so imagine trying to align these things because you have the frontal image and then you have the back image, and they're both. So you would have to have a bas relief. First of all, it's historically implausible. Why on earth would someone make a separate bas relief just of the backside of Jesus? Like, what was that made for? And there are no known examples of that in history. In fact, Hugh Ferry, when he was on my show, he showed an example of certain medieval bas reliefs kind of thing. And again, there was no backside present. So number one, there's historical implausibilities to positing a dorsal side bas relief in the first place. Secondly, even if there was such a thing, how would you get the frontal image and the backside aligned perfectly so that it is consistent anatomically with having covered a three-dimensional corpse kind of thing and wrapped around it? That would be highly implausible to do. Plus, getting that aligned with all the blood stains and off-image blood stains, which represent, that are consistent with wrapping a three-dimensional. This guy must have medieval genius kind of thing. So I think that's totally ruled out and implausible given the evidence. But another problem is, as I said, Hugh gave some examples of what he thinks constituted these bas reliefs. Now, in order to minimize these distortions in terms of the vertical collimation of the shroud images, you have to use an extremely shallow bas relief, and that's what modern day skeptics like Hugh Ferry and Luigi Garlicelli are using. But if you look at the bas reliefs from the medieval period, they're not so shallow. They're quite deep, especially the one Hugh showed us from the Quem Queritas ritual that he thinks caused the shroud. So therefore, you would have even worse lateral distortions than what Cicero came up with using a shallow bas relief. So those are some of the main problems I would say with it there.
Yeah. One thing too, as you were talking, I was thinking, we talked about the historical references prior to the 14th century for the shroud. And one of the things that an artist typically does, and I remember going into the Chagall Museum in southern France, and he has these incredibly beautiful paintings. I mean, it's just amazing the expert and just artistic value that he has. But around the outside of the museum were all of his practices. So he would do a draft in charcoal or in whatever of the face, and then he'd do another one just to get it exactly right. And so it was those practices that were done. And so there was a series of images that led up to the painting that he actually wanted to achieve in this beautiful piece of artwork. Well, one thing that's missing with the shroud is there are no practices anywhere. How did the artist, if it was created by an artist in some fashion, how did he just create it that first time and where is the evidence, or where is, the possibility that he had to practice? And there's never any mention of that kind of practice, and there's never any mention historically that, hey, this guy, painted a shroud over here, and he practiced there, and he practiced over here, and he did this. None of that exists. And so then here we have on the authenticist side, we have this historical tracing going all the way back, maybe to the fourth century, and then potentially even back to Paul in Galatians 3:1 in the Bible. And yet, for the authenticists, the non-authenticists, there's nothing really that shows that there's a history of how that image may have been created by a human.
I think that sort of raises a great point. Believe it or not, it's the ultimate shroud skeptic, Hugh Ferry, who first clued me into this issue of the historical implausibility of what most skeptics envision. When they envision a medieval artist, they envision some sort of mad medieval artist or mad scientist in his lab cooking up this, I've recreated the Frankenstein Shroud of Turin images and stuff like that, just totally by accident and struck by lightning, and there it is. But that's totally implausible to how artists actually worked in the medieval period. Look, these were professional craftsmen. There was no single artist alone in his studio coming up with some image ad hoc. No, these guys were hired and commissioned by either churchmen or a king or some rich duke or something like that to commission to create something specific that the other person wanted, and that sort of thing. And they had a whole studio of employees under them, and people, apprentices and stuff like that, who also had to, copy his method and go with him and learn from him and stuff like that. In some cases, some of the discarded stuff with artists, they would give to their apprentices and say, okay, you finish this one while I make the next copy, or something like that. So the technique wouldn't have just been lost to history. It would have been continued on by his apprentices and stuff like that. And those would have continued on. It wouldn't have just been this one unique, incredibly remarkable image that no one can explain, and the technique just died off with that artist. That's just totally implausible to how medieval artists worked in medieval times. So yeah.
Right, exactly. So that's where the school of Chagall, in my case, and I don't know if there was one, but the school of this and the school of that, and Monet and Impressionism and all of these other schools actually did a lot of learning under these apprentices to learn the techniques and what have you. Now,
And that's what
no, go ahead.
oh, sorry. Just one last thing, because it's relevant in the debate. This is where it's relevant. I read out a quote from the non-religious agnostic medieval art historian Dr. Thomas de Westlow, and that's why in his quote he's saying, look, this just doesn't fit into the milieu of medieval artwork at all. If it did, then art historians like me would know exactly who painted this, where it was painted, when it was painted, who were the proteges and stuff like that. We would have all this information. So, and that's why medieval art historians with actual PhDs ignore the shroud. It's not a medieval artwork, and they know it. So they say it's outside of our expertise.
Right, exactly. So let's go on to the next one, and that is this one I have trouble with. And this one is, I don't know, sometimes authenticists use, well, God just did it. He can do anything, and so God just did it. So I have trouble with those kind of references. But nevertheless, one of his objections was he didn't like the God miracle references, is kind of how I worded it. And why would God leave this piece of evidence, the shroud? Why would God leave this evidence versus something else? To be evidence of his existence and Jesus's existence, as well as Jesus's resurrection. So and this one is kind of I don't know, it's an unusual kind of a question. So I don't know what kind of thoughts you have against or for that.
Yeah. So in the first place, I guess in terms of atheists having a problem with an explanation of God did it and leaving it at that, I think this is what's called a personal explanation, and that is consistent with what philosophers call the principle of sufficient reason or principle of sufficient explanation. It is a sufficient explanation, right? And we see this in life all the time. So if I say, well, why is there a bowl of Kraft dinner on my desk here? Oh well, Dale did it. I cooked it up. That's a sufficient explanation. What atheists usually presume is they want to presume, and to James's credit, he doesn't do this, but a lot of atheists do, is they want to demand a scientific explanation where they demand intervening mechanisms, right? Well, it has to involve certain intervening. What did God do? Did he snap his fingers and that caused the air to move, and that the air moving caused X to do Y and stuff like that? They want a chain. And that's what happens in naturalism, right? In the natural world, okay, if I want to move my arm, maybe my soul chooses to cause a certain brain state. That brain state causes a neuron to go down and causes certain patterns to go, and then finally my arm goes up. But for the purposes of and most of the time in shroud studies, people do that, right? Like Bob Rucker does that. He believes there was the initial supernatural act, a basic act on God's part, and that triggered a series of intervening mechanisms. Protons, started spinning and going up in vertical directions, and that created an electrical discharge, and that created the oxidation on the fibers. So those are fine if there's a scientific explanation, but I don't see it. Let's pretend God did do it as a basic action. Sometimes he does this where he just speaks and, okay, creation was a basic action. There are no intervening mechanisms. It doesn't make sense to demand a scientific explanation for those. So I just wanted to clarify that. The second part, in terms of James, now James is asking something very peculiar that's not necessary to give a sufficient causal explanation. He admitted in the debate that God did it is a sufficient causal explanation for the shroud images. But he got into this, well, I want to know, why did he do it this way? Why this and not that? So he's demanding a contrastive explanation. Why did he go for option A as opposed to B? And that's not required to fulfill the principle of sufficient reason. That's something beyond. And this is Alexander Proust talks about this, like with quantum physics. We don't have to present a contrastive explanation necessarily. So he's going beyond. But in the debate itself, I did, just out of charity, I went above and beyond, and I provided my answer to that contrastive, and I gave a contrastive explanation. And I basically said, because providentially, God's main goal in creating humanity, under my hypothesis, is he wants to save as many free will creatures as possible, right? So he knows that by producing shroud images when he did, in exactly this way he did, that will lead to the end goal of allowing as many free will creatures to choose salvation versus damnation. If he had performed some other miracle or did it at a different time or whatever, change any of the variables, then my answer is less souls would have freely chosen salvation as a result. And that's why God chose to do the miracle. So that was my speculation, trying to provide a contrastive explanation. But number one, that's not necessary to fulfill the principle of sufficient explanation or reason. And number two, he can't, so long as he can't disprove or say that my contrastive explanation is improbable, then there's nothing to object to. Like the skeptical objection fails.
Right, exactly. What I like is what Andrew Dalton says, and he did it a couple of times, and I've always got to try and remember the exact phrase, but the image on the shroud is the natural result of a supernatural event. And that right there, I think, is just so fascinating. Now, whether God said that day, okay, Jesus, you're now resurrecting, and we're going to leave evidence of this resurrection on the shroud, or not, it doesn't. I mean, to me, it doesn't matter that much. What I just find interesting and fascinating is that there is this image, which we believe is, as authenticists, which we believe is the natural result of a supernatural event.
Yeah, and that insight is what kind of stands behind my I make that argument about the irrelevance of the dating, or let's pretend the shroud is medieval for a second or whatever. And I have that same insight that all of the scientific evidence, all of those properties about the images, that's whether the shroud dates to 1300 or 30 AD, the science remains the same. And I think that we are arguing the science alone is sufficient. The properties of the image is sufficient to say, yes, these images were miraculously created. So that's why I can see the dating is totally irrelevant kind of thing, unless a skeptic can prove that it is relevant in some way. And I haven't been able to hear anything that's convincing on that front of my end. But does that make
Yeah.
sense?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Well, and that brings up the concept of the minimal arguments or the minimum arguments, and he brought this up, James, as well, which is he wanted to know what are the minimum arguments, so to speak. How many aspects of the image need to be reproduced by a human? Is it just the superficiality, which we haven't talked about? Is it the 3D dimensionality of the image? Or is there something else related to the image? And I know you go on quite a bit with the minimal effects, and I find your argumentation there just awesome. So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So I call it the minimal relevant features approach, and so I'm sort of copying Gary Habermas's minimal facts approach for the historical evidence for the resurrection. So my criteria basically, I only use facts that are highly evidenced in the scientific peer-reviewed literature, right? Secondly, I only use things that fulfill the scholarly consensus criterion. By that, I mean about at least two-thirds or more of knowledgeable, informed shroud experts accept them as facts. And thirdly, that I use try to use the minimum amount of features necessary to make my argument and establish that there's a miracle, rather than, because there are other facts out there. There are hundreds of features and properties, and technically speaking, all of them need to be reproduced. If you're going to reproduce the shroud, you need to reproduce to have an explanation for everything that's there that's been studied, right? So, the scorch marks, okay, they require an explanation, that sort of thing. But typically, what I was trying to do was try to minimize it to, like, we want to ask what's specifically relevant for the image formation process, because that's what we're ultimately trying to explain and that sort of thing, right? So in that case, yeah, you have to explain everything. You have to be able to explain the superficiality on all three levels, the three dimensionality as evidenced on the shroud, the vertical collimation, body image uniformity as well. No body images underneath the blood stains. All of the features that Stirp proved have to be reproduced, because otherwise it's called the law of cause and effect, right? If your cause is insufficient, meaning it's in principle, it's incapable of producing the effect, the properties we see on those shroud images, then it's not an explanation for those images. So what James was trying to say in the debate, though, he was trying to say, well, look, Luigi Garlascelli and Hugh Ferry, there have been these experiments and they've all failed to reproduce, the superficiality on a thread level or some, one or more features. But that's irrelevant, because if we just changed something in the procedure and we did another experiment, or we did 10 more experiments, we could reproduce that. And my argument in the debate, I don't know if it came across properly, you can tell me, but I was trying to say, look, we can do 1,000 more experiments. Hugh Ferry could perform his experiments wearing a pink tutu. It's not going to matter. You're not going to, this technique is inherently incapable of reproducing superficial images on the top 2 to 4 fibers alone. It'll always be deeper. And that was what I was trying to say, is that the process itself, we can reason from the laws of physics and chemistry, plus it's backed up from all of the experimental data to date. you're never going to be able to reproduce or cause that effect. And therefore, it's not an explanation for the shroud. It fails. Yeah. Does that make
Yeah.
sense?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think you're right. And that's where I have also some trouble even on the authenticist side is that we have spent scientists and researchers and shroud authenticists have spent a lot of time looking at one dimension. But as you mentioned, there are a handful of really important things that have to be reproduced. And you know, you went through a litany of them: the superficiality, the 3D, the alignment of the body and the blood. There's the fact that there's no image underneath the blood and things like that. And and being able to do that in one method is what's I think pretty critical, and not doing it. Okay, well, we have a laser over here, and we have a something over there, and we have something else that can do it. It has to be all together and be able to bring everything together. And the skeptics have not yet been able to. Well, even the authenticists haven't been able to figure out how to do that. And so that's then where this miraculous image kind of comes from, is that being the natural result of a supernatural event.
Yeah. I think the STERP scientists, in their conclusion, they had a great way of phrasing it, where they're like, look, that in terms of this need for the conjunction to explain the conjunction of all these properties. Well, look, the physics is precluded by the chemistry of the shroud, the chemical properties of the shroud, whereas chemical explanations are precluded by the physical properties of the shroud and stuff like that. And it just shows that when you try to create a single coherent method that some alleged medieval artist cooked up in his lab and then was lost to history, you just can't do it. It's not going to reproduce all of the image features as observed on the shroud. And that's law of cause and effect. This is basic science that you learn in grade 7 and 8 science class, right? So if the hypothesis predicts, okay, I'm going to, if this method reproduced the shroud, was what caused the shroud images, well, I predict it's going to create superficial images and uniform images. It doesn't reproduce that. Well, that's the principle of falsification. That falsifies the theory. So yeah, yeah,
Right, absolutely. Yeah. Now this next one, I remember him saying this, and I screamed at my laptop. I says, "No, that's not right." And the next one has to do with the radiocarbon dating, and the statement that James made was that radiocarbon dating is a very refined methodology. Well, it is absolutely today. In 1988, when the radiocarbon dating took place, it was very new, and the actual method that they used was very new. And one of the reasons why the radiocarbon dating labs were interested in doing this was they wanted to prove that this new method was actually verifiable and something that other archaeologists could use to date their samples. And so back then, it was absolutely not a refined methodology like it is today. And even today, and I'm sure you've got more to say about it, but even today, radiocarbon dating has trouble dating cloth, and they state that right up front. They need to have other facts as it relates to the dating of anything to be able to be confident in saying that yes, this is good evidence that it actually dates to that particular date. So talk a little bit about that.
yeah. You're absolutely right. It's so beta. I quoted Beta Labs and stuff. That's Teddy's favorite go-to quote, which is Beta Analytics Labs. So one of the top labs in the world in terms of carbon 14 dating, and they have this little for dating textiles and dating textiles only. They have this little qualification that says it needs to be, we won't even date your textiles unless it's part of a multidisciplinary study. And they want other fields because this is especially important when the textile has a controversial history or an unknown history, as the Shroud of Turin did at the time, right? It was controversial. Is it medieval? Does it go back to 30 AD? And that sort of thing. And back in the 1980s, this problem was especially pronounced. So James kind of laughs at other dating techniques like wax and so, oh, that's just new, that you just got to dismiss that. Well, as you said, AMS dating was only 10 years old. I think we're fast approaching that limit, probably within the next 3 or 4 years. It'll be 10 years old too. So I guess we can just blindly believe that then. But look, it was very new at the time, and there were intercomparison studies and tests done, published in the radiocarbon journal, for example, proving that the AMS labs did a terrible job dating samples of known age, especially of textiles and that sort of thing. And I think in one of the studies done in 1989, they had a 40% failure rate. So 2 out of the 5 labs. That's massive, statistically speaking. That, and they only had 3 labs dating the shroud. What are the odds that all 3 of them got it wrong? It's very high. And it's based on this systematic bias criterion, which I find interesting because today, as of 2019, with Tristan Casabianca's publication and the other 6 peer-reviewed journals, that's precisely the problem with the carbon-14 dating done on the shroud. Is we have this now proven, it's a 98.6% probability that some sort of systematic bias or error was affecting those results. And that's precisely the same criterion that the AMS labs failed in all of these intercomparison tests back in the 1980s and caused them to get fudged numbers and stuff like that. So yeah, I find, look, it's totally unwarranted to place any faith in the 1988 carbon-14 dating of the shroud. Yeah, I just think you can have no confidence that those dates represent the actual calendar age of the shroud unless and until we figure out what is causing that systematic bias. And skeptics have an answer for that. They had different pre-cleaning treatments, and maybe that explains it. They have no proof that's what happened. They're just speculating. They're just hoping that's the answer. But there's another, maybe it was neutron irradiated, as Bob Rucker has calculated in his MCMP computer calculations. You can't just assert and assume the answer you want. We need proof as to which of these solutions, or maybe it's something else, is causing the systematic bias. Until we know what that is, you are unwarranted. It's illogical to conclude the shroud is medieval. We need to know what that systematic bias is. You can't just assert, oh, well, it's this. We have no proof that it's this, but this would allow me to believe it's medieval, so I'm just going to assume it's this. That's not the way logic works. You need warrant before you believe something.
Yeah, and that's where I always find it interesting that the skeptics want us to do all the homework and they don't do their own homework. And so, to your point, that systematic bias and that 98.6% probability on what that means is just something that really it flies in the face of that whole radiocarbon dating. Until that is explained, we have to throw out that result. And now it may also mean we have to throw out other results. There are certainly a handful of other dating techniques, and the wax S is a new one, and it is approaching about 10 years now, as old as the AMS method was for the radiocarbon dating at the time in 1988. And then there's, there were some others. Ray Rogers did one on the vanillin and the lignin, and then a couple of other ones, and they all kind of have different error bands and things like that. So all of them have to go through the same rigor. And of course, I think what Bob Rucker has done. Bob is one of the best shroud scientists I think out there, and I mean Giulio Fanti as well, and I'm sure there's others. But when I hear Bob talk and what he and how he puts together what may have happened to those samples that were radiocarbon dated by those 3 labs, it's just absolutely fascinating.
Absolutely. Yeah, I totally agree with about Bob. He was one of the best. Back when I was doing the panel review debates with Hugh, he was one of the best ones in terms of certain topics, like
Yeah.
the carbon-14 dating image formation. Yeah, he's an expert on that stuff, and he always did great. So yeah, I always loved having him on the show.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, these next 2 are kind of interesting because they relate to the physical size of the of what's reflected on the cloth as it potentially imaged the body. And the one is that the two arms appear to have different lengths, and the other one is that the
Hmm.
fingers are very long. And it's fascinating to say, well, those are interesting arguments, and there's certainly some hypotheses that we have for both of those. So let's take the first one. What is the current hypothesis on the different lengths of the arms?
Yeah, so I guess in terms of the different lengths of the arms, that there have been a few different explanations. So some people have said, well, maybe one of the arms the arms are dislocated from the shoulder. It makes them appear longer than they really are. Barry Schwartz was known for saying, well, we just can't tell if it's too long or not because there's a scorch wound right by the elbow area, and that means we just can't tell that, so his answer is to say you don't know if it is too long or not. The answer I think is best. I really think Dr. Gilbert Lavoie has sort of solved the issue, and it's sort of the answer. Look, it appears like one of the arms is 3 inches longer than the other, but appearances are deceptive. It's actually not. If you do the actual measurements, they're the same length. And the reason for the appearance, that extra 3 inches, is due to what the skeptics all love to recognize and use, right, to rule out that there is a body. There are these wraparound distortion effects that are caused. So one of the arms is over the other one, and it's bent upwards, and then the fingers are then curved downward. So when you have the cloth covered, again, depending on how the images were formed, if it was formed through radiation or something like that, you would have certain wraparound distortion effects evident in both the arm and the fingers, making them appear longer than they actually are. But when you actually do the measurements, taking into account these factors, they are the same length, and the fingers are a normal length. And other people have tried to explain the fingers differently. Again, I go for Gilbert Lavoie's answer, but Gary Habermas, they'll say, well, if there was like x-rays, maybe you're seeing the bones in the fingers, so it looks longer, but that's because you're seeing bones and stuff like that. So that's another answer for that.
Yeah, and when I look at when I was in high school and we had the skeleton hanging down, and you look at the all of the bones of the hands and the arms and the fingers, it certainly looks like when you look at them, you go, man, those fingers are really long. But I think there's an effect of not only are the finger do they appear long because we're just seeing kind of the outline of the finger, but we're not necessarily seeing all the skin and the impact. Like there's probably a half inch of skin to where that one joint is versus the first knuckle and the second knuckle. And so there's a whole bunch of things in there. So I don't think that necessarily that the fingers are necessarily long. I just that one I think is pretty easily explained, and I like your concept of the wraparound effect that may also have an impact on it. And my
Because they're
my
curved downward.
yeah, exactly.
I
And
was
go ahead.
no, I was just going to say that because the fingers are curved downwards the way it is, right? So it's just funny the skeptics never notice that, but yet they're the first to mention these wraparound distortion effects when it benefits them. Like, oh, it can't be a body. And yeah, we know that. We've been there since 1939 with Paul Vignon. The pro shred guys are ahead of you. You guys are just kind of catching up as skeptics.
Well, they got a long way to go, yeah.
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 Hopefully they'll get
Well,
there one day.
yeah. Now I like your concept of the wraparound effect even on the arm and the length of the arm. Personally, there's been a lot of study. Well, I don't know what a lot is, but there's been study as to whether that the shoulder could have dislocated as Jesus was carrying the cross, or that maybe it was just the patibulum. And if he did fall, and we kind of have good evidence that he fell, if he did fall, that fall as he went down possibly did dislocate his shoulder. And on the other hand, too, it may have been that maybe it didn't dislocate, but the muscles were loosened, and then when he was finally hanging on the cross for a long time that the arm finally did dislocate or the shoulder did dislocate. So I kind of lean towards that explanation, but I like your concept as well of the wraparound effect.
I guess I'll just very quickly respond to that. So the thing that I would want to test then, if the dislocated shoulder based on a fall, so like he fell down on the ground and landed in such a way as to dislocate it. Well, what about the limestone dust findings? Has there been any limestone dust in those specific areas that would be consistent with dislocating his shoulder? That would be something that might confirm or disconfirm that. So yeah.
Yeah, interesting. So to that point, for the audience, there is definitely limestone dust on the nose, on the tip of the nose, and on the knees, on the front of the knees, and then certainly on his feet, which would have just been accumulated there as he was walking. And which is also kind of interesting that dust quite often it comes up was the body washed or not. And so if it was washed, why didn't they wash the tip of the nose? If it was washed, why didn't they wash the knees and the feet and get that dust off? And so it kind of possibly points to supporting the hypothesis that the body was not fully washed. It may have been washed partially, but not fully. Yeah, the next one is about rigor mortis. Now, when we look at the body as we see it reflected on the cloth, it looks like his head is leaning forward and his legs are bent. So let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, and that's obviously playing a role as to why he can cover his genitals, right? Because I think James mentioned it's impossible if you're lying flat on your back, it's impossible to get into that position. Well, the shroud man is not lying flat; he's hunched over a little bit, and that's why there's no front neck that's visible and stuff, right? So I think this is clearly evidenced from, okay, well, Jesus went, as Teddy Pappas argues in her paper, that Jesus went into rigor mortis, and she's hardly unique. I mean, this comes from Giulio Fonte and Isabel Pixek before them and stuff like that, where this position, Jesus, when he was up on the cross, would have gotten into rigor mortis in this hunched over type position with legs bent and that sort of thing. And then, okay, he stiffened up when they took him from the cross and brought him to the tomb. Again, they're in haste to bury him, so that's why they would do a partial washing and maybe just break the rigor mortis so that his hands will cover his modesty, because that was sort of the least they could do in the time they had. And then they buried him, but they left the rest of the body in place in rigor mortis, and it held there. According to Teddy's research, it could last. So 36 hours is sort of the rule that most nurses and medical students will learn. Teddy's research, though, references a 150-year study proving that this standard is not actually true. It can last a lot longer than that, even up to 5.8 days, depending on certain circumstances and that sort of thing. But the average is they estimate Jesus probably would have been in the tomb about 39 hours, approximately that, 39, 40 hours, plus or minus, right? And rigor mortis, the average rigor mortis actually would last well after that, into that time period. So there's nothing implausible or rules out that he would have been still in a state of rigor mortis at the time of the resurrection, presuming that's what caused the images. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing I have a challenge with, and I've got a hypothesis, but I don't think it's really that well supported, is that if the legs are bent and if the head is leaning forward, then how is it that underneath the legs and behind the head, now the behind the head is maybe a little bit easier because of the way the cloth is wrapped, but underneath the legs, what is holding the cloth up to give you a good image on the bottom of the legs and be consistent across the bottom of the legs as opposed to what many theories that you see is that there was some kind of a wrapping to hold the cloth against the body, but still you'd have a draping effect especially under the bottom of the legs. And so I don't know if you've thought about that or what your thoughts are there, Dale.
Yeah, I think so. So yeah, the binding strip would be a partial explanation, but I think also Mark Neer on the show mentioned that the spices these were not put onto the body in liquid form; they were in solid form, and it was mostly about counteracting the smell of the body, kind of thing. So Ray Rogers and Barry Schwartz have postulated, well, maybe these could be used to prop up especially if the legs are bent, there's space to prop up the underneath of the cloth, I guess, and that would cause it, the draping, the droopy bit to be raised up and closer to the legs. So yeah, something like that. Again, the cloth would still need to be flat, like there couldn't be wrinkles and stuff like that, but it's still plausible that they put it
Yeah.
that way.
Yeah, because that's kind of where I lean towards is that maybe that 75 pounds of aloes, whatever that is, well, 75 or 100 based on how you measure it, but 75 pounds of aloes may have been under the body to kind of cushion the way the body was laying due to the rigor mortis and just keep the body in that position, I guess. Because I don't think that the people that were preparing the body, Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus and then the women, if they were preparing it, they certainly weren't preparing it thinking that an image was going to be made on the cloth. They were preparing it for other reasons, and they just, for whatever reason, maybe put the aloes underneath there.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. So yeah,
Yeah. Um,
great minds think alike.
Yeah, exactly. Um, the last two bullets here, one is on the wax-S. We've kind of talked a little bit about it and the radiocarbon dating and the confidence levels and stuff like that. So I think I'm going to skip over them, but I'm sure you have some other thoughts, Dale, that you remember from that talk that we haven't covered. And if there's any of those, let's maybe go through them.
On the wax, you're saying?
No, no, no. On the video that you did with James, were there anything else that stood out to you that we haven't covered that you wanted to kind of refute now?
Yeah, so I think I'd be interested in sort of getting your take a little bit on so getting not just with respect to the application to the shroud, but the first part of my presentation was on my general criteria for identifying a miracle, and obviously all the skeptics came out and they had certain critiques and said, "Oh, this is a foolish way to do it," and that sort of thing. I strongly disagree. But I'm kind of curious, what did you make of maybe my general criteria for identifying miracles in general? Did you feel it made sense? And feel free to be honest if Teddy tells me I'm an idiot all the time. So yeah, what was your take on it?
Yeah, exactly. Well,
I won't
Teddy,
be offended.
Teddy is great, by the way. For those of you who don't know Teddy, she's been on all of our shows, Teddy Pappas. She's done some incredible research on the blood and rigor mortis, and I think she's trying to get 2 volumes for a book that she's putting together on what she's found. And I know that putting a book out is always harder than you want, and trying to make sure that you have all of the references and the science and the medical evidence put together. So she's done a wonderful job there. No, I think your minimal facts concept makes so much sense, and and that is really any kind of an argumentation perspective, that's kind of how you have to approach the problem of being able to say, this is why I believe this is one way versus this is why I believe it's another way. And of course, in this case, is why is the shroud authentic versus not authentic. So, yeah, no, I love that approach. And I mean, I remember early on you had a PowerPoint and we went through those, and I just I still just love all of that so yeah, no, I like that. I like that approach.
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah. And I'm consistent with the philosophy of miracles, which is a secular subfield within the philosophy of religion, and they have these these two aspects where I just sort of developed and nuanced them, my criteria for identifying a miracle to for the purpose of identifying what I call religion authenticating miracles. So that that some of the most brilliant minds throughout history have come to the same conclusion. So I just want to say, people like Hugh Ferry who just dismiss it out of hand and say, oh, there's no rationality to this. You know, I've engaged the literature, the scholarly literature. I don't think you have there, Hugh. So I would want you to give it another rethink. And for other skeptics like him that just sort of dismiss this. And what I think it's funny too, the skeptics that do just sort of dismiss it and reject it. I always remember wanting to ask them because I it takes a lot of thought to figure out what is the minimum necessary and sufficient standard. It's easy to say like, oh well, by what criteria would you identify something as a miracle? And the atheists come up with some, oh, that's easy, write his name in the sky or something like that. But I was trying to come up with criteria, the minimum necessary and sufficient criteria, the least common denominator type thing. And, I've never heard skeptics that'll deny these criteria from scholars like Tim McGrew, who's written on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, has these two aspects about the improbability of the event, plus the religious context and other scholars and stuff like that. But if you ask the skeptic, well, by what criteria do you identify something as a miracle? They don't have any. They haven't really given a lot of thought into what the minimal necessary and sufficient criteria would be. And really, I feel so one of the things James accused me of with my criteria was rigging the game. I invented these criteria to make it impossible to conclude something isn't a miracle. And I just want to, first of all, that's just total rubbish. Look, I've evaluated various miracles from various religions, including Christianity, which have failed under these criteria. So just within Christianity, to show my bias, I'm a Christian, and I really like the argument from fulfilled biblical prophecies based on the oracles of the nations in the Old Testament. I really like that. I wanted it to work, but I evaluated it given my criteria and it failed. So clearly it's possible to, fail to qualify as a miracle if the evidence isn't good enough in fulfilling these criteria. But the main point, and I'll stop after this, is that I think it's the skeptic, and I think it's with James who really has this. It's impossible to ever conclude that a miracle has taken place. They always want this skepticism of the gaps, or this perpetual skepticism where, even if you have all the evidence supporting that it's a miracle in the here and now, yeah, but maybe it's possible 5,000 years from now we'll discover some natural anomaly we never conceived of, and that can explain it. So you can never conclude it's a miracle. You always have to be, we don't know what it is kind of thing. And I just wanted to say that's not rational either. You need to be able to infer based on the evidence you have right here and now.
Right. And I think you're right. I think that's and certainly science gets better and better, but at some point, it smells like a miracle. It walks like a miracle. Therefore, it must be a miracle. And then, but I think though the evidence, well, and as a Christian, of course, the evidence is overwhelming in the way we interpret that Christ did resurrect, that his body went somewhere, and then the shroud, and we believe that the shroud then is the evidence of the natural result of that supernatural event, and that's kind of what our faith is based on. Now that you don't have to believe that the shroud is authentic to have faith. That's just another piece of the puzzle, so to speak, for basically all of Christianity and that one singular event that really defines Christianity.
Absolutely. Well said. Yeah, I totally agree.
Yeah. One thing I'm going to change subjects here a little bit on you. And I'd just like to hear your thoughts. I've been trying to work out an argumentation on something on an interview I did with Dan Clausen. And one of those was has to do with the evidence. And why would someone make a fraudulent piece of art? What was the motivation? And if the shroud then is a fraudulent piece of art from the 14th century, then what was the motivation for that? And I think there's a couple of legitimate ones. But what's also interesting, though, is why did they make that art with those features to that art the way that they made it? Where did the evidence come from that they would say, okay, well, if I'm going to make a fraudulent piece of art that is going to be, I'm going to sell it. Maybe that's what my goal was, to sell it. Okay, it could be. Or it could be that I just want to evangelize, and this is going to be evidence. And in their case, well, this is proof of resurrection. Therefore, you should become a Christian. So that could be their argument as well. And so the question then becomes is two things. One is this evidence that somebody painted it and created it by human hands? And then if they did, what was the basis that they used to create the shroud the way it is? Why does it include all the blood? Why does it include the head? Why does it leaning forward? Why does it include the hands, one arm being longer, or whatever, the legs being bent? And using that as an argument, going all the way back to whenever it was that the first copy or the first fraud or whatever that was made, and where did that evidence come from? Now, what I'm struggling with is kind of putting a clean way to represent this. And the one challenge that I have too is if I was going to make a fraudulent piece of cloth that was going to have been found in the tomb, um, what would be my source of information for that? Let's say I did that in the third century or the 10th century or the 13th century. I would go to the Bible and I would look through the Bible and I'd say, wow, look at that. There's blood, and but there's no mention of bent legs. There's no mention of his head being forward. There's no mention of an image being created. There's no mention in the New Testament, in the four Gospels. Okay, maybe there was something with Paul. He saw something or claims that he saw something, but why would that artist have created this thing that has the all of those pieces of evidence? And so that right there is kind of like, well, he should have just made an image with the blood on it. There shouldn't have been an image on there. It just should have had blood on it. And I don't know, but maybe give me your thoughts on that. And I'm like I said, I'm trying to improve my argumentation for that.
Yeah, I think so. So again, this kind of comes. So in terms of the debate, James provided two possible explanations. One, that it was a fraud. So this is his answer as to why. What's their motivation? One, it was a fraud to make money, or number two, it wasn't a fraud. It was a pious act of devotion, kind of thing. Now, what's funny is, on the other side, I did give an answer to why initially. Basic, okay, it's to authenticate the religion of God is creating these miraculous images to authenticate Christianity. So I answered why as well as he did. But what happened in the debate was the skeptic, well, I want a deeper answer as to why. I want this contrastive explanation. Why did God do the miracle this way rather than that way? So I think what's good for the goose is good for the gander. Well, let's probe, let's demand a contrastive explanation from the skeptic. And at one point, I think I hinted at that by saying, why I raised the example of the chicken leg. Why would a medieval artist depict a leg properly and depict another leg as a thinner chicken leg type thing? That just doesn't make sense. So we can also point to the skeptic. I want a contrastive explanation. Why did the medieval artist do it this way with all these features, off-image bloodstains and all the anatomical aspects, hunched over? And why images at all? Why not just blood? And this is kind of what Dr. Thomas de Weslow raises, right? This is why I pointed to his video, and we have that comparison, image of the shroud images versus the shroud of Besancon and all the other medieval artwork. And Thomas de Weslow says, look, medieval people were gullible in those days. It was easy to fool. Just paint it. And that would fool. The shroud of Besancon fooled thousands of people for centuries and that sort of thing. It was easy. So when you place this demand for a contrastive answer to the question of why, why this way and not another way, I think the skeptic does far worse in answering that with a contrast compared to us as Christians, right? I gave my answer about in God's providence, he knew that doing this particular miracle when he did, the precise way he did, leads to more souls choosing salvation in the end, in the grand scheme. That answer, he can't disprove that. Whereas what answer is he going to have to why on God's green earth didn't he just paint images, or just have a shroud with just blood on it, as you said, or that would have been convincing to them. Why, if he did make images, why on earth did he make images that with anatomical inaccuracies in them, like long fingers and a chicken leg and hunched over? Why not just depict it the way the medievals would have expected it? So yeah, there's problems there. So I would put it that way: is you're demanding I want a contrastive explanation. Why this way rather than another way, which is much more plausible for a medieval artist?
Right. Right, absolutely. Well, those are great answers, and I appreciate that. I hadn't remembered the one leg being like a chicken leg as opposed to the other one, and so that's also thank you for that. And I do like your point about why God would do anything, and his goal, as we interpret it, and we might be wrong, of course, but it is to get more souls choosing salvation, and that's a great way to put why does God even care what we do? I really, I think that's a great argument. Well, let's, as much as I'd like to keep going, I'm sure there were other arguments, and I don't know, maybe one of these days I'll listen to that video again, and I'll definitely listen to some of your other Shroud Wars one. And when you do your Shroud Wars one, we'll have to do the follow-up and, and do kind of like the post game show on some of your Shroud Wars. But in any case, yeah, Dale, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Any last things you want to say, and then we'll close out.
Yeah, I guess just yeah. First of all, thank you so much for inviting me onto your show, and I was really glad. It really heartens me to get the emails and stuff from people like you behind the scenes appreciating going on, because obviously, a lot of in public, it seems to be mostly skeptics that are commenting, and so sometimes you wonder, okay, is it doing any good? Is any of this sinking in with the background in terms of my philosophy of miracles theory and trying to be rigorous in applying that to the shroud study. So it's always I'm very much appreciative when I hear from you and a couple others and stuff like that behind the scenes saying, yeah, there's something here. This is helpful. I'm appreciating this and getting something out of it. So yeah, I'm always grateful to get that feedback and to come on your show.
Absolutely. Well, I was so excited after that interview, after I listened to it, and I said, "Wow, this we gotta talk about it." And so glad we were able
Absolutely.
to. So really appreciate it. So Dale Glover, of course, with Real Seekers, and anything you want to talk about, how people can find you and your podcast.
Yeah, so I have a blog at realseekerministries.wordpress.com where you can go into the blogs for the shows, and I post up even for the debate. The last blog I have, I'm on sort of a vacation right now, but my last blog is for this debate, and it has a whole bunch of sources related to the topics brought up in that for you guys to research. My YouTube channel is just Real Seekers, plural. And yeah, you'll be able to find me if you type in Real Seekers or Real Seekers Shroud. I will probably be the first one that pops up. And yeah, like I said, I try to cover a bunch of topics. So I have a lot of shows on the Shroud, but I don't just focus on that. I try to focus on all topics that are relevant to the Bible and Christian apologetics and the philosophy of religion. So yeah, tune in to any number of topics you might be interested in.
Yeah, fantastic. So on YouTube, it's Real Seekers and definitely some good stuff, great stuff out there. So, Dale, thank you so much. And of course, this is the backstory on the Shroud of Turin. And to the audience, really thank you. And would love to hear your comments and thoughts and what we missed, what we may have gotten wrong, or what we may have gotten right. It's as Dale mentions, the positive and the negative comments are always very welcome, and we learn from them. And hone our argumentation skills. Dale, thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Not a problem. My pleasure. God bless.